Hello, Gerry.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
Very good. How are you doing? Where are you in the world?
Well, I'm in Thousand Oaks, which is in California, the Free State, and we're having a moderately fine time, comparatively. How about you?
All right. Now I'm in Portland, so everything's a little stressful, but
Yeah,
as advertised, but which is weird because it wasn't the way it was here for many, many years. But
right.
yeah, it's been a hell of a summer. So yeah, but you're safe and everyone's okay. House is
Yeah,
good.
yeah, we're
All right,
good.
good.
We're good.
Good to hear. Good to hear. So I always bring up because sometimes I get from readers it's unclear like who knows who and who's friends with who and who lives in a house together. Like it, some people think we're like it's like the real world, like the old real world where we're all like living in a house together, and
Well,
because some of us
that was
do.
actually true in the early 70s.
Yeah, and also today it's still true. And then there's people like I'm doing a panel on Sunday with Mike Oming. He's like my brother. We're family forever and ever. You and I don't know each other at all, not at
Yeah,
all.
we've
So
met a couple of times, and that's about it. Yeah,
yeah, so I kind of wanted to like let everybody know this is like a first actual conversation, but it's in person, which is a different tone than if we had a history together.
sure.
Our history is growing shared life experience. You
Yeah,
paved a road, and I'm just walking down that road as fast as I can. So I wanted to talk to you about some of those places on the road. I did want to start, if I can, with the Punisher saga that happened this summer and where it is now. If you're up for
right.
talking about it, if you don't feel like talking about it, I respect that as well.
No,
But
no. I'm actually pretty proud of the creators who became involved in this project. As you know, there's always been this controversy. Well, in recent years, a controversy about police and military using the Punisher symbol um, on their vehicles, on their uniforms, and it's been it's been used, I think, in a way to intimidate and try to impress a particular political point of view that the Punisher as a character, in my view, doesn't represent. Uh, and as the guy who co-created him, I think I have some authority on that. So yeah. So when the Black Lives Matter movement started up, and we saw some instances of militia types and police type people using the Punisher symbol on their vehicles and gear. My wife and I thought, well, this would be something that we could possibly reappropriate and turn to the advantage of the movement. So we came up with this notion of asking young artists of color through Twitter to create logos featuring Black Lives Matter and the Punisher skull, which we would then put on T-shirts that people could buy. And with that purchase, we would contribute the full value, of the profits to Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, which we ended up raising about $75,000 for
wow.
the movement here, which was really impressive. Yeah, we sold over 5,000 T-shirts, and we had about 21 artists contributing logos, and it was really very touching. Very
Yeah, that's amazing.
very impressive. Yeah, and I
I
and I. I hope to see some of those shirts, in protest movements in the future. So,
Well, I had a vaguely unique perspective on this as you were dealing with that first wave of what I'm sure was stressful. The same day, Miles was at the same protest. Like there were people representing Miles at the Black Lives Matter movement in the way I would only dream of, like a
right, right,
perfect representation. And then you were there having the opposite experience, like
yes.
same thing.
Well,
But then but what was interesting was what a like decades long journey this is for you with this character, and to get to a place where unironically misunderstanding the character, like to the point where that, and then I couldn't help but think about, like, is there a version where like decades from now this happens to Miles? I'm sure there was a point where you couldn't even imagine like the Punisher being misappropriated like this, right?
Well, I couldn't even have imagined the Punisher having the longevity
That's
and the reinvention, over the years. He was. It was not intended as a character that, when we initially conceived him, wasn't even going to be more than a one-shot or two-shot, character. The credit really goes to the people who've taken the character after my time on it and developed him into an iconic figure. But I think it is important to try to get back to basics, and it is weird. I mean, I imagine. You over the years, you've created characters and possibly seen them taken over by other writers. And what are your thoughts? I mean, as you see these things go on,
Well, I've had that's why I think about this with you a lot, because I've had an enormous amount of good luck in this regard. Jessica Jones being taken care of by superior storytellers to me, and then Miles getting getting an Oscar and Jessica getting a Peabody. I mean, this is way higher goals than I had in my heart for the characters. You dream, but no one, but where the luck comes in is that it's like kind of like your kid goes off to college, like you've done your best. And you hope, and you're there for them if they need you, but if they're on their own, right? Like Miles is out there, like, and now every day, and also I have like Miles never stops. Like now with the video game and the Spider Cat, like my whole feed is just filled with love and giggles, and it's everything you'd ever want. And I didn't do it, right? Like I'm not the author of this, so I can just sit back and enjoy it. And I really do enjoy it. But I would really not enjoy what happened to you. And I think about it because it's out of our hands. That's my point, is that like with what happens with Miles is it's out of my hands. And boy, am I lucky. Just look at all these people who care about him adding their truth to it. Right. And then you have,
but in the case of Punisher, what's neat is that the misuse of the character actually gives me a platform to speak out for my own, political or social beliefs. So, when there's an article about, a Punisher symbol appearing in an inappropriate way, I can then respond to it, and it is almost immediately picked up, by at least our particular media. But then sometimes it breaks through to a larger media. So it's an opportunity to be used, and that was kind of why I was both upset but pleased by the opportunity to do something powerful with the help of other creators this summer.
A lot of our peers sometimes make things worse when things get weird, and you handle that as just about as elegantly and perfectly as possible. Other peers were talking about behind your back about how cool it was to see how you handled it. I just wanted to share that with you, because I know a lot of us are just alone in our rooms, not hearing from anybody. Just want to let you know that one, the commentary about how you handled it was inspiring to us. It's certainly like made us like, if that happens, like that's how to handle it. So thank you for that.
Well, you have to just sort of try to roll with it, but at the same time guide it a little bit, with your own belief structure, however that. Whatever you personally want to bring to it.
I also love that you and I share a TV cinematic universe together that we did not ever plan on, but that, like, we are forever connected with the Punisher, Jessica Jones to a large part of the audience
yeah.
have their own little Marvel universe.
Yeah, it's such a good little Marvel universe.
Yeah,
too.
it is. Yeah.
I mean, if it had been a crappy one, that would have been embarrassing. But certainly, I think that both Jessica Jones and Daredevil and Punisher, those three were the best achievements of that.
Luke Cage too. Luke Cage is
yes, absolutely. Luke Cage certainly stands up there.
They're all good.
Yeah. Well, you can't lose with Mike Coulter.
So let's rewind a little bit about that. The Punisher, and I don't want to spend the whole time on the Punisher, but it is fascinating watching the character evolve through the decades and have different interpretations in cinema as well. Mm-hmm. And do you how do you feel about it? What is are you just zen?
Well, when the first Punisher movie came out with Dolph Lundgren, I was actually so out of the comic book business at that point that I had not even been aware, that it was about to happen. And of course, this is before anybody at either. I mean, both companies were trying a little bit to sort of give credit or some financial rewards to people, but there was no real consistency to it. So when I heard about this, I was actually heard about it in an embarrassing way. I was at the time single, and I was on a date with a agent from CAA, and I was a screenwriter, TV writer at that time. And so we're on this date, and you try to make a good impression with somebody, so you try to find something you can talk about, in common sense. And I asked her, so like, what's interesting going on at the agency right now? She said, oh, well, we got this project that we've been pitched for one of our actors. It was actually pitched for Christopher Lambert. And she said, yeah, and it's based on this comic book property. This character at Marvel Comics, he's a ex-Vietnam vet, who's gone on a mission and as she's telling it, I'm slowly being filled with rage because this is my character and I knew nothing about this and I'm not going to get a dime out of this. And I blow up in this explosion of, those sons of bitches, what are they doing? And she's slowly moving back. Needless to say, we didn't have a second date, but that was my first experience with dealing with having my characters transposed into film or television. And then I subsequently, there was a Thomas Jane version, which again, I wasn't really involved with, although they did ask me to come in and do some work on some commentary for the DVD release. And then finally we have the Netflix version, mm-hmm. Which I honestly feel is the best version. And I'm actually felt the most connected with because, the people involved did actually reach out to me. We did talk. My status with Marvel is, in a good place. So there was, some nice feedback, on that end. And there was credit.
I love that there's so many versions of the Punisher that you skipped one.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, the one with what's his name?
Ray.
Yeah, which actually is probably the most authentic to the comic book in a lot of ways, but was kind of maligned, and I think unfortunately so, because the director did a terrific job, but small budget, low budget, mm-hmm. not really trying very hard from the studio's point of view.
Well, you brought up a subject that is just deeply fascinating to me, and a lot of our fellow creators as well, is that you had a glorious career at Marvel and DC and all over comics, and then have this just out of nowhere tremendous second act as a very successful TV writer working on projects. And I will admit that I snuck and I watched your interview with John. Okay. So I do know a little bit about this, but I do want to talk more about your transition into this to being a TV writer, because I was a fan of yours and then you would hear Gerry Conway's writing Law and Order. And
how did that happen?
Oh, good for him. No, you're like, oh, good for him, because I actually knew like a couple of directors who told me like that's the most money in the bank gig in television, that like they run a million times forever. The royalties are insane, right? So that's amazing, but it isn't the kind of material I think of when I think of you, right? I think of like, sci-fi opera and deep Spider-Man character, and then you're doing, whodunits, really.
Whodunits and procedurals, yeah.
You did, so people who don't know, you did Diagnosis Murder and Father Downing Mystery. So you were doing quite a lot of work on some really sturdy network dramas, which in itself is its own art form. It's a completely different art form from the one we do as our day job. So I want to talk about that, but I want to kind of come in with, I know that the first step towards this was you and Roy Thomas working on the movie Fire and Ice with Ralph Bakshi and Frank Frazetta. I would like to spend the rest of the hour talking about that. No, I am just deeply fascinated about how you transitioned from comics to film, because now a lot of people do it, but back then, and even in the earlier part of my career, there was a sense, much like there were TV actors and movie actors, and never will they meet. The writers had little silos they were stuck in, and that was it. So, how did Fire and Ice come about?
Well, Roy and I actually came together originally, because of our friendship and because of our mutual interest in getting into writing films, and we sold our first script based on the fact that the reader for a production company was a comic book fan, and she knew who we were. And so
that's my business model, by the way.
Yeah, yes, you've got to have a fan somewhere, and she promoted us to the producer, and the producer bought our script, which made us legit writers. And then at that point, the connections that Roy had built up with Ed Pressman on the first Conan film enabled us to, be considered for that film. But it wasn't until we wrote the Fire and Ice script for Bakshi that we were actually considered B-list, enough B-list writers to be brought in. It was kind of weird. I mean,
so you had to elevate to B-list to get.
Yeah. Well, you talk about how you get stuck in silos. We actually had to almost hide our comic book writing background to be taken seriously as screenwriters. And so pretty much for most of the first third of our film writing career, that was like the second or third thing that people would find out about us. The first thing would be, oh, you worked with Ralph Bakshi. Oh, you worked with Ed Pressman and Dino De Laurentiis. Then, and at one point, Roy and I were actually warm in Hollywood. We used to say we got, not hot, but warm. And we were guys who were, if we weren't like the first, we were at least the second team that would be called in to write a big budget fantasy film. But as all things will, this sort of fell apart eventually. My partnership with Roy fell apart before that happened. But in the process of working with Roy, I had met a guy named Dean Hargrove when we were doing a project for Showtime, and Dean had been brought in as an executive producer on it. And after Roy and I stopped writing together, I reached out to a whole bunch of people asking for advice. What should I do? And Dean was the guy who actually responded with a job. He gave me a job writing for a show called God, I'm blanking on it. But it was this kind of knockoff of the two cops, one rogue cop, one tough cop. That sort of deal.
Starsky and Hutch.
Yeah, like that. But it was a 6-episode show, and I did a rewrite on a script, and then after that, he gave me a script, and then after that, he hired me. And in a weird sort of way, from that point on, I was pegged as the mystery writer guy because Dean was, the producer of Matlock and Jake and the Fat Man and Father Dowling mysteries and Perry Mason movies, and I wrote all of those, and I became the guy that he turned to. I was like his number two guy, which is basically was my role in Hollywood and TV, was the number two guy, who was brought in to work on any show that he was doing. And then subsequently that became my rep, that I was a really good procedural / mystery writer. And I could not get hired to do a single fantasy show.
Unbelievable.
I went in, I pitched for Lois and Clark, I pitched for Birds of Prey.
That kills me. Birds of Prey kills me.
Nothing. Yeah. I couldn't get into any of them, because I was a mystery writer. I mean, the 90s were weird, man.
Yeah,
very weird.
It's just absolutely fascinating. And I grew up in a time where I must have read this early on in my career because I got obsessed with it. Like some of the writer says, as soon as someone attaches a label to your name, stop what you're doing. Just immediately pivot to another career because someone put you in a box and you got to get out of the box.
Early on in the 70s, back when National Lampoon had its offices downstairs from Marvel Comics, I used to, my way of making my way in the business was I would just show up at offices. I was a teenager and I had no shame. I would just show up at offices. So I showed up.
I did the same thing.
Yeah.
I did.
I showed up at the National Lampoon offices and became friendly with Henry Beard, who was kind of this sardonic. I mean, if you've seen the film version of the Lampoon origin story, he's a lot like that, So he was this kind of mordant, sardonic guy. And after a while, I sold some stuff to the Lampoon, and I brought in a friend to see if he could get some work, because I like to help people out. And this friend of mine was this very talented science fiction writer who had just placed a story with Playboy magazine. And Henry was like, oh, you sold a story to Playboy. He says, yeah, I did. He says, I hope you like that story because that's the story you're going to be writing for them for the next 20 years. And of course he was right, because at that time, Playboy, if you wrote a certain kind of story, that was a story that they bought from you. You couldn't break out of that mold. And so my friend was both happy and kind of distraught. But
no, so someone says, like you get a label, you say thank you, and then you start hyperventilating.
Yeah.
You're like,
yeah.
Oh no,
I mean,
I'm a crime
it's a
writer.
good label. Hopefully it's a good label, I mean, I was fortunate I was able to move from dad mysteries or mom mysteries to procedural mysteries. There's a lot of people who worked on Dean's shows were marked as, old-fashioned writers in the 2000 market.
Yeah. So how did you pivot to Law and Order? Because that whole you were on a few Law and Orders, right? You were on,
actually, I ended up. I wrote 3 or 4 Law and Orders, and then I was on Law and Order: Criminal Intent for 5 years as a producer.
Superior show. We all
I love that show. I mean, and I had the opportunity to work with Vince.
That's amazing.
Vince D'Onofrio.
So we can now look at that show as like Kingpin, like origin story. Okay.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Well, Vince reached out to me. He was doing these little videos for food banks, where he was raising money, and he asked me to write one for him. And I said, "Can I do a Goran for you?" So we did a little Goran video that he did, where he was like doing the Aria interrogation scene. And made it into a little comedy bit, but it was a lot of fun. I mean, it was weird because I made that transition through, as most of my transitions in comics to film to anything, through a series of accidents and happy coincidences. I worked with somebody on a show that I was hired for because I was known as a mystery guy, and then he went and worked for Dick Wolf on a project that wasn't going anywhere, and he suggested me to come in and do a rewrite on it. I came in and did a rewrite on it. It got picked up to a series. Then I met this guy who became the executive producer of that. And then when he went to Law and Order, he asked me to do some scripts for him. And it's you trace these things backwards because you can't trace them forward. You can't make a plan.
Well, and it's part of the reason I wanted to bring it up is I know a lot of people who watch these are people like us who are working on their creative careers on some level, and sometimes the alchemy of a career can seem madness and unobtainable when you're starting, when the road's in front of you and it's there's a wall of fog right in front of you, no matter where you are on the road. But as you get older, you realize that it's just keep working. Just keep doing work you believe in, and doors open. Not always the doors you think are going to open, and
I call it stirring the pot. You stir the pot. Even writing spec scripts. I never expect any of my spec scripts to sell, but there seems to be this psychic, I don't believe in ethereal phenomenon, but there does seem to be this karmic force that when I finish writing a spec script, when I'm like burned out and done, somebody offers me a job on something else. And I have but if I'm not writing a spec script, nothing is happening. I could be sitting there ready to work, nothing, but as long as I'm doing something, as long as I'm proceeding in some way to create and to put something out into the universe creatively, I get something back, and I don't know why that is. But
I'm very serious. I have come to fully embrace and believe in this unseeable creative energy that bounces back and forth. I have had a few instances in my life that are so undeniable and crazy that that I go, all right, there is something out there. When you put stuff out in the world, it comes back. It does, sometimes years later, sometimes decades later, but it's energy you put out in the world, and it has come back always to me in a phenomenal way, in a surprising way. There was an incident I'll talk about soon where a musician whose work I was obsessed with when I was working on something decades ago found that work without knowing that their DNA is all over it, and connected to it and sent me something. And it shocked me 20 years later. Shocked me. So, I mean, and that has happened a couple of times. And as you get older, that's because now as you get older, you get to see all the seeds you planted and what's going to happen with them. But that kind of stuff happens. I know I sound like a Portland hippie talking about this kind of stuff, but it does, man. It just happened. I think
it's about productivity and your own personal openness to take. One thing which whenever anybody asks me what you should do to advance your career, one thing I always say is you just have to keep working and creating, and as long as you're creating, that's the goal. What happens after you create it, you're not in charge of. My wife is a very talented film editor, director, and comedic writer. She does a web series. She's always worrying, will anybody see this? And she actually has like millions of views. It's a very successful web series, but she's always worried about, maybe nobody's going to get it. And I said, it doesn't really matter. What matters is you do it. You put it out there, and then you see. You've got nothing to say about how other people are going to react to it, and you certainly don't have anything to say about how the universe is going to reward you if there is a reward. The work itself is the goal.
The rewards aren't always immediate. sometimes, I mean, we live in America particularly is a very
Yeah.
weekend culture for everything, TV, movies, music, but we know that with stuff that we put out there that wasn't a big hit when they came out, and it ended up being the biggest hit ever, financially for us over time. Whereas other things that were like the #1 book of the year, and then nobody talks about it the next year. You know what I mean? So it's you never know. You just never do. So
Justice League Detroit, which was my great shame, which at the time was like, it seemed like the death of my involvement with DC, and it really was. Then becomes, my a financial pipeline in my 60s. So, fine.
Well, you said the magic word, so I'll bring it up. So the one bone I have to pick with you is Justice League 200, because you ruined me. Like there's books that aspire, and then there's books that just to the point where I just this one I've spent so much of my career attempting to recreate the magic of Justice League 200 or just aspire to it. Including like last month in Legion of Superheroes, I had 44 artists drawing Legion of Superheroes, attempting to accomplish what you guys did in Justice League 200. And I will say I have this deep, potent memory of obsessing over that book, and not only because of how it's structured and its beautiful homage to Justice League's DNA of how they told those stories, but you did something for me. You introduced me to a few artists. You also introduced me to I already knew that different artists had different voices, but seeing them laid out in almost a portfolio style like that it allowed you to really compare and contrast the line work of Brian Bowling versus Joe Kubert, right? And I'm at an age where I'm, here's where I get Chris Farley on you, and I apologize, but I'm at an age where I'm literally unpacking the magic of comics and what they mean and what you can do with them. And there you kind of like laid out in front of me like a masterclass of how to do it, and I just can't thank you enough. And then, but the real thank you for me for that book is I remember very specifically. That's where I was introduced to a few artists' work, but Brian Boland was the first time I had ever seen his work, and I literally ran to the comic book store like the next day and found Judge Dredd, and like I figured out who he was, and here was Camelot 3000 and all that, and I remember that feeling. You introduced me to other people's work, and that work took me on a journey, and so my first year at Marvel. They let me do a book called Ultimate Marvel Team Up, where I could go sit and do, just hire and do whatever I want. And I very arrogantly called Bill Sienkiewicz, who I did not know, and said, "Hey, you want to draw Punisher and Daredevil with me?" And he said yes. And I'm working with one of my heroes. I meet like my first year in mainstream comics, and like I'm working with one of my heroes. And then I got like the book came out, and I'm like, people are going to be like, "Wow, Brian, you got to work with Bill Sienkiewicz." Like I'm like, and the first comments were, "Where did you find Bill Sienkiewicz? What a discovery! Wow, you invented like I invented him or something, right?" And then I immediately shot back to being in my room discovering Brian Boland and the power that we have as creators to introduce others' work to people, right? And then I felt it with Bill Sienkiewicz. Like I immediately corrected and said, "No, this is a legend that I'm lucky to be working with." But every time I make these choices about who we're hiring, and I'm like, "Oh, I would love to show off this person to whoever's reading this book, because I know there's someone out there who's going to be blown away," right? Yes. And so I think about those Brian Boland moments with you, and I make a lot of choices based on that feeling. I know this is very intricate. I'm sorry, but yeah. No. It's amazing how many times I've tried to do Justice League 200. I think it's like we're at like 9 times. This one, I will say this Legion project may have I'm finally over it. I finally may have done it, but in my heart. but we'll see. It kind of builds up steam again. It
You
also
know,
gives you an opportunity to work with people you can't work with, right?
Yes.
So,
well, I mean, the big advantage I think that 200 had over, I mean, subsequent years is that some of the original artists who were associated with those characters were still alive and available. We were able to get Jim Aparo and Gil Kane in the same book. We were able to reach out and get Joe Kubert, and introduce somebody like Brian Boland, who hadn't been associated with, DC to that degree, at that point. Today, we're into the fourth and fifth generation of artists, so it's kind of hard to find the as iconic connections as we were able to get with those. I mean,
now you also found the artist that matched the character. There was a historical precedent with each one.
And I think that was what made that book feel so special. Was it wasn't just a really good artist doing that, but we had Jim Aparo doing Phantom Stranger. I mean, which is like, how perfect can you get? And I think that was a moment in time that would have been hard to replicate.
I know it is. It's a very hard moment in time to replicate. I've tried,
and I know. I'm glad that I've given you a goal, though.
It did, and I must say, honestly, the jokes aside, it allowed me opportunities to touch some of my heroes and collaborate with people I would be scared to, or even peers whose voices are so outside of my world but it has opened many doors, is what I'm saying. By attempting to work with people outside my sphere, it has literally made it my goal to just stay out of my sphere. So I appreciate that. Just to answer, if I can, we've been missing a lot of questions and comments. There is a National Lampoon documentary. There's a documentary, and there's also a dramatized comedy film based on the documentary on Netflix, directed by David Wayne and starring Joel McHale as Chevy Chase, which is kind of amazing. So it's called like Stoned.
It's a completely, what is a stupid and it was based on that line from Animal House.
Yeah.
A futile and stupid gesture.
Yeah.
A futile and stupid gesture. Yeah.
So I'm a huge comedy and comedy history nerd. It's an awesome doc and also awesome book as well. So if you want in on that.
It was kind of sad. I mean, I knew all of those guys for the most part. Not like I know my friends, but having met all of them, met Doug Kenny. I did a piece of work for Doug Kenny, Michelle Coquette, and Bay. I mean, they were right there. It was like right there. But then it was such a flash. Just such a moment in time where everything seemed to be connecting between comics. I mean, Roy Thomas appeared in some of those. Roy and Jeannie Thomas appeared in there.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Those nude underwear for the deaf?
Sure, yeah.
That's Jeannie Thomas.
Okay.
Yeah. And then there was this Roy and Doug Kenny and Jeannie in some of those fumettis, that's them. It was a very weird time.
Yeah. All right, let me hit a question. This is for both of us. Let's before you write a character, say Superman, how many books do you usually read in preparation? I plan on writing comics one day, so I thought I'd ask. Writers do research, and comics are no different than anything else. In fact, comics, the research is just a lot more fun. And by the way, if the research isn't fun, don't do the book, don't do the gig, no matter where you are in your career. If you're not enjoying all your reading and your planning, that your little brain is saying, this isn't for you. In fact, I think you can see, here's a lot of Supermans right behind me. So all of them get read. By the time I got to Superman, I was an adult who'd read a lot of Superman comics already, so I dove in and reread a lot of things and was surprised how much I had already read, like, just throughout life. But yeah, I treat everything like it's I came up through crime fiction and true crime, and it's a lot of research, and I just still treat it that way. That's what you
Brian,
do.
can I ask you, what was the era of Superman that you felt was most influential on you? I mean, when you approach the character now, what do you sort of
see? That's a tough one. It's gonna sound like I don't mean to sound like I was in high school when John Byrne went to DC, and
Sure.
And that was a big effing deal
Sure.
for all of us. And that I started buying, like a lot of people, I started buying Superman comics because
Sure.
and my X-Men guy was doing Superman. So that's probably the time I spent the most time thinking about Superman. But then I went to a convention where Kurt Swan was there, and that stuff became more important to me. Like John, and again, every creator does this, but John's work opened up to what I found to be more satisfying Superman just before him, and also John's run was all mired in the crisis editorial stuff that very well. So there was always something weird about it, and I must say I re-looked at it all when I came to DC and thought about John's choices. I mean, I was even given a book called Man of Steel. Like, I really had to think about the pedigree of the name and everything. So I thought about some of the choices John made, and in retrospect, it felt like it was really the John Byrne show. Which we've all been guilty of at some point. And I thought, I definitely don't make this the Brian show. Make this the Superman show. Like as much as me coming to DC was being advertised, let's not make my voice the most important part of this thing, because that stuff doesn't always age as well as you'd want it to. So that's what I thought about the most when I was coming here. But also Superman and Legion have what I would consider to be like fits and bursts of genius. Like instead of long runs, there's like little pockets of
year here, year there,
Like I can tell you like I forgot Walt Simonson had done a Superman special that rattled me, right? And then when I went back to my reread, I'm like, oh, Walt's there again. This is just getting me where I need to go. But also, I was of an age when Alan Moore did his Goodbye to Superman, Whatever Happened to the World of Tomorrow. So that was the most joyful Alan Moore story I had read, even though it was also the saddest. But it was, compared to his other stuff, it seemed much more hopeful, and it really got me. So
it was a sweet story, yeah,
very sweet and very well done, and also Kurt Swan right there doing what he doesn't get enough credit for, to be honest. So So you?
I think the Kurt Swan era was when I was growing up, but the Wayne Boring Superman was really my touchstone from the late 50s, and the early exploration, the early stories about Krypton, that the Wayne Boring era brought. There were all these novel length issues, where because at that time the average Superman issue had 3 stories in it, and when they would do a full issue, it was a novel length story. And I remember the early Laurie Lemaris stories, the stories set on Krypton, where Superman would use his memory thing to somehow remember things that happened to him as a baby. And that era just sort of stuck with me, when I came onto the book, because most of the 60s, from about 63 through the period when Denny finally was brought on the book, Denny O'Neil was brought on the book, that era sort of didn't really have much impact on me. I was mostly a Marvel fan. during that era. So for me, the Wayne Boring early Kurt
I don't think Wayne gets enough credit for what a wonderful illustrator his line weight was like Steve Rude, amazing. And you never hear him spoken of in that regard. And I having
he also did this one thing with Superman that nobody has done, which is the running through the sky, which I've always loved, the Superman running, with one leg up, and it just, that's an image that I really, really respond to. But that's, my childhood, so.
Oh yeah, for sure. But yeah, and just so I said for the record, also I was 10 years old when Superman the movie came out, and it rattled me to my core. And my son is 7 right now, and I'm watching him get just rattled by some of my friends' work and stuff, like stuff he doesn't know. It's so wonderful. He literally we're stuck here all day, so he's just like following me around the house, lecturing me about Groot, and it's just a reminder of my mindset back then. And I know that every time I'm writing Superman, it's just so part of the DNA, that feeling, the John Williams music is part of it. Someone keeps asking a question I definitely want to get to. Gerry, did you have a feeling Carol Danvers would be as big as she is now when you started?
Gosh, no. I mean, anything that we did back in the early 70s, we all thought we were riding a doomed ship. We all thought we were on the Titanic, because comics were clearly not going anywhere. The market was dying out from under us. And these characters were, these were efforts to try to keep the business alive. And I can't take any real credit for Captain Marvel or Ms. Marvel, beyond, I consider myself like a grandfather, in that case, and not even like a step grandfather, because all I did was take a character from that one person had created, gave her some powers, and then somebody else took it and made it into something really well. I mean, there's somebody else obviously being Kelly Sue. So, it's very cool, to be even slightly associated with that.
That's amazing.
I mean, all of that stuff, seriously, comic book creators today are kind of rock stars in a way. And back then we were just, guys who, my generation was the generation that decided they wanted to be comic book people, professionals. Before us, the comic book professionals were people who couldn't make it in other fields. That's what they saw themselves as, people like, even someone like Gil Kane, who was such a wonderful comic book artist. His goal was to be, have a newspaper strip, to be considered, a valued member of the Society of Illustrators. It wasn't to be the best comic book artist ever to work on, characters like Green Lantern. I mean, it's kind of weird now because we have this public persona, thanks to things like the MCU and the Arrowverse and all the TV shows based on Image Comics, and we're all like, quote, famous people, or somewhat famous people. But back then we were just guys who tried to make a living, and mostly guys.
It's hard. I agree with you that people know our names more than they would have. Like even when I first broke in, when I first had like a book that sold, like it feels very different now. But I think it's imperative to creators coming up: do not look for this. Do not chase fame. Do not look for rock star. All that rock star behavior is bullshit. It doesn't get your work done. It just is annoying. Don't do it. Just get your work done and let people think nice thoughts about you. Don't
try to be a star.
We have both watched this. We have both watched, I don't know how many you've seen, but I've seen dozens of people swagger into comics and swagger right the hell out, because it's not sustainable, and it's not what the job is. The job is get your work done, So, and if anything comes afterwards, fantastic, brilliant. But that's what happened, right? It's not something we were going for. But when you see the creators put on the sunglasses and head into San Diego, and
it's not a good deal. I mean, I'm sure there are benefits, but my attitude is one of gratitude, and I'm always surprised when somebody wants me to do something. That's generally my posture in life.
Yeah, but there's always every once in a while someone comes into comics and goes, "I'm here. You're welcome." And
you got to be so good to make that work. That's not how it works.
It does that. So all the characters, and there's quite a few at both companies, and I saw you talking a little bit with John about I was surprised you brought up Vixen as being a character that does you well financially in the ancillary. What would you say? What would you think would surprise fans about what we're in those worlds? What?
In terms of what money making operation?
When you see a royalty check from every once in a while, that you go, huh?
My most successful character financially, for me personally, is Killer Croc.
See, that's exactly
because he's appeared in every Batman cartoon show. He's in every Batman. He was in Suicide Squad. He's in every video game. It's like he's money in the bank, and I have to thank Bruce Timm and Paul Dini for putting him into the animated show, which is really what propelled him forward. Because they needed a character that was kind of big and muscular and powerful and simple to design, which is what Killer Croc is. You can just do him he has an easy silhouette. But thanks to that, I got all these Killer Croc toys around my house. I've got all these movies and video games. It is money in the bank.
You completely blew up the comment section. That completely everyone loved that. So yeah, that's amazing. I knew it was something like that. I thought it might be fixing. Yeah. That's pretty great. Let me hit some questions.
How about you? I mean, obviously Miles is probably
it's Miles, but in the same vein, I get really excited when his best friend Genki shows up in things, or his mother. Sure. I get really people don't know, we invest equal amount of love and energy into the supporting characters as you would the lead character, and sometimes even more. I'm forgetting to wrap it up. But Miles hit the not to be braggy because I didn't have anything to do with this part of it, but Miles during the movie hit the weird trifecta of three things I really, really, really wanted as a nerd, but didn't know I wanted, which was I got I got a look at this.
Oh wow!
Right? I never in a million years thought I wanted a Campbell's soup can. I did. So it was the Nike shoes, it was Nike, the tennis shoes, the Campbell's soup, and I think Pez or something. Whatever it was it felt like sometimes it's hard for people like us to know if we've succeeded. In the face of success. Yes, right. You're like, I don't. But you go Campbell's soup can. That's it. There you go. All right. I'll leave on that one today. Sadly, we have to wrap it up. I'm very sorry that we didn't get to more questions. People were asking some very good ones. Some of them are actually more appropriate for the conversation I'm going to have with Mike Oeming on Sunday night. So if anybody wants to join us for a hang on Sunday, a chill hang with John Sutras and Mike Oeming, we will be doing that for part of this. Do you have any more paneling you're doing for this convention this weekend?
No, this is pretty much it.
Anything you want to promote before they unplug us?
No, good. People should follow me on Twitter if they like listening to raging political opinions.
I love you are I will say a very solid follow. Excellent.
Thank you.
Not fun. Yeah, you don't go off the rails. You just right there. Gerry, So I've said it to you privately, but I'll say publicly, thank you for everything you've done. Thank you for the characters you've created, but also for the energy that you've put into comics, because that's, as we get older, that's the stuff that I aspire to. Having a career you can look back at fondly like this is the goal. And just thank you for just always being the guy, man. It's just really amazing.
Thank you. You're too kind, Mike.
All right.
I'm just flattered. Take care and be good, and hopefully I'll see you in Portland next year.
Yeah, yes, or if there's a Portland, we will be here, and I will see you. And again, thank you to Baltimore Comic-Con, John Suttress, and Mainframe Comic-Con for having us. This is really awesome.